Good evening. Welcome to the last of the three panels that we have had this month at Williams College as part of the series we've titled The War in Gaza and the International Context. My name's Galen Jackson. I teach in the political science department here. I'm looking forward to another really terrific conversation this evening. I want to begin again by thanking the sponsors of this event, which include the Class of 1971 Public Affairs Forum. Yeah, please. And let me recognize the members of that class in attendance tonight, which include Steve Brown, John Chambers, and Steve and Jory Lathan. So thank you all so much for being here and for your support for this event. I also want to thank the Cohen Family Forum Fund, the Lecture Committee, and the Class of 1946 Memorial Lecture Fund. As I said during the last two panels, none of this is possible without their support, so we're deeply appreciative of that support so we can have these incredibly important conversations. I also want to again thank Carrie Green for all of the hard work she's done organizing these events. She's put an enormous amount of time and effort, so thank you so much, Carrie. So to recap, the first panel we had, which was primarily focused on Zionist thought and U.S.-Israeli relations, we were joined then by Noam Pianko and Bernard Avishai. Last week, the panel dealt more with Palestinian politics and the politics and culture of Gaza specifically, and we were joined by Dana El-Kurd and Ilana Feldman. Tonight, we are shifting gears again, and we're mainly going to be focusing on American policy. And although we will certainly dedicate a good portion of our time to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the ongoing war in Gaza, we're also going to be talking about the Middle East a little more generally, and U.S. policy towards the region a little more generally. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined here tonight by two of the leading experts on American foreign policy in general and in the Middle East specifically. Let me begin by introducing Aaron David Miller, who is currently a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, but whose experience working on these issues goes back much further. Perhaps most notably, he served in a variety of roles in the U.S. State Department for more than a quarter century until 2003. While he was there, he worked on Middle East policy and specifically on the Arab-Israeli peace process, and he received the department's Distinguished, Superior, and Meritorious Honor Awards for his service. He's written 5 books, most recently, The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. It's a catchy title. Search for Security, Saudi Arabian Oil and American Foreign Policy. PLO, Politics of Survival, The Arab States and the Palestine Question, Between Ideology and Self-Interest. And finally, a book that has played a key role in my own thinking on these matters, and which I have assigned several times in my courses, The Much Too Promised Land, America's Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace. So it's a real pleasure to have you here tonight. I'm also joined by Stephen Walt, who is the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs in Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. His list of publications would require the remainder of our time here, so I'm only just going to list the books he has written. He is the author of The Origins of Alliances, which was the first book that I did a book report on in graduate school. Revolution and War, Taming American Power, The Global Response to U.S. Primacy, The Hell of Good Intentions, America's Foreign Policy Elite and the Decline of U.S. Primacy, and directly relevant to tonight's event, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, which he co-authored with John Mearsheimer back in 2007. He also has an influential blog with Foreign Policy Magazine, and by any measure is one of the leading scholars of realist theory in the United States today. So thank you very much to both of you for being here. We're very lucky to have you. Yes. Before we get into substance, I want to reiterate a few ground rules before we get started. The goal is to keep it to about 75 minutes. I will try to accomplish that. I failed the last 2 times. The first hour will be a discussion among the 3 of us up here, and my goal is to leave 15 to 20 minutes for questions from the audience thereafter. Again, I want to emphasize the Q in Q&A. This is not a time for comments, and I do reserve the right to interrupt if I don't hear a question coming in a reasonable amount of time. And I want to reiterate as well, we are obviously discussing sensitive and controversial issues tonight. I think that is, we're in exactly the right place to do that, a college campus, so that is no bad thing. But for this to be a productive exchange, all of our opinions need to be offered respectfully, and we need to listen to our guests respectfully as well to get the most out of this. So again, if we proceed in that spirit, I'm confident that tonight's event will be every bit as successful as the last two were. So let's get into the substance. I do want to begin by talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and U.S. policy toward that issue and the ongoing war in Gaza. So, but before we get to that, I do want to ask both of you how you would define U.S. interests in the Middle East and what you see as the key goals and objectives that U.S. foreign policy should be trying to achieve in that region.
First of all, Galen, it's an honor to be here with you. Thanks to Williams College and the class of 71, and it's great to be here with Steve, whom I read religiously. He really is extraordinarily smart, and he's a fabulous writer. So if you don't read him, you should at least read the foreign policy articles he writes, which are trenchant and wonderful. I told a story to Professor McDonald's class earlier on, and I'll repeat it because it's my entry into Galen's question. When I left the State Department, the last Secretary of State I worked for was Colin Powell. He gave me two pieces of advice. The first piece of advice was don't ever try to come back. I took that to heart. 27 years took a toll on my marriage and my kids. I had enough. They were extraordinary years. We failed more than we succeeded. But the second piece of advice Powell gave me, I rejected wholeheartedly, and that was, he said, if you can avoid it, try not to look back. I've spent the last 23 years in the public conversation looking in the mirror, trying to figure out American foreign policy generally and specifically on Arab-Israeli issues, what we got right, what we got wrong. And the one lesson, it didn't take a genius to extract this, is that when we failed, whether it was war-making or peacemaking, invariably we always failed because we saw the world the way we wanted it to be, not the way it was. And even though honest analysis, and I was trained as an intelligence analyst, often leads to paralysis, if you want to fix the world, if you want any chance of trying to repair it, then you first have to understand it. And that involves, it's not pretty, it's not pleasant. And I say this only because when it comes to the Middle East, let me be very clear. I had an inkling of this when I was working, but I'm now absolutely persuaded of it. This is not a land of opportunity for American interests. We are caught in a conundrum. We cannot transform the region. By now we should know this, the two longest wars in American history, where the standard for victory was never could we win, but when would we leave? And extrication is not the metric that you want to use to judge the performance of the world's most consequential actor. And we can't extricate ourselves from it. This is the dilemma that we find ourselves in. And I just mentioned to Steve, if he was a fan of the Eagles, I am. Their iconic song, Hotel California, you know that line. You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave. We have interests there, we have adversaries there, we have partners there, we have allies. As far as I'm concerned, here are my must-haves if you're talking vital American national interests. The must-haves. We need to be vigilant with respect to counterterrorism in the wake of 9/11, even though we moved on. We're going to need access to Arab hydrocarbons for the foreseeable future, even though we're not dependent on them. Others are dependent on them, and oil trades in the single market. And number three is preventing the emergence of a hegemon with a nuclear weapon. My judgment, those are our three vital interests because they pertain to American security and to American prosperity. The rest, as far as I'm concerned, even though I spent most of my professional life, and I wish it wasn't so, trying to deal with the Arab-Israeli issue, the rest of the Middle East, in my judgment, is discretionary. it would be nice to have. It would be nice if we could solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It would be nice if we could bring better governance to countries which have ungoverned spaces, which is a significant problem. It would be nice if we didn't have 5 Arab states in active phases of dysfunction: Lebanon, Libya, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. It would be nice, but we can barely repair our own dysfunctional house. Why do we believe that somehow we can transform the houses of others? So my advice would be prudent, be careful, and make sure as you pursue these interests that you can marry means and ends.
Sure. So if you were hoping that we would start this off by disagreeing with each other violently, you're going to be disappointed at least by the first exchange, because I largely agree with everything Aaron said, and he said very nice things about some of my work. I've been a big fan of Aaron's for a long time. One of the saner voices we've had in American Middle East policy, and somebody I always learn from as well. So in terms of vital interests or security interests, I would point to much the same list. For many decades, the United States has had an interest in energy resources from the Middle East, not because we necessarily needed them ourselves, but because they were part of maintaining a productive world economy. Other industrial powers required them. The only thing I would add to that is the importance of Middle East petrochemicals and other energy sources is going to go down over time because of climate change. Now, some of those producers, Saudi Arabia most notably, will sort of be the last producer standing because their production costs are relatively low. But the strategic importance of oil and gas from the Middle East has to decline if the species is going to survive into the 22nd century. And that's going to alter, I think, the way many countries view their relationship with the Middle East. That probably won't happen in my lifetime, but that's where we're headed, and that's something to bear in mind. Second, yes, we've had a counterterrorism mission there, actually going back to the 1980s. I can remember concerns about Libyan terrorism and things like that. The only thing I would remind everybody is that we greatly exaggerated the danger that terrorism arising from the Middle East posed to the United States after 9/11. Many people assumed that 9/11 was simply the first attempt, and there were going to be lots of repeats of this happening here in the United States. Fortunately, we were able to take a variety of measures here at home, all right, to prevent things like that from happening. And now the risk that an American is actually going to die in a terrorist incident, particularly one arising from the Middle East, is vanishingly small. There are many things to worry about, but that's actually not a huge one. It's a problem to be solved, but I'm not sure it's really a vital interest. And I would also point out that most of our efforts to deal with it, say most notably the invasion of Iraq, probably made the problem worse. Had we not invaded Iraq, ISIS would never have emerged, and all the problems we've had with ISIS since then were partly the result of things we had done. And then finally, of course, we want to prevent the spread of weapons of mass destruction, particularly in hostile hands. And I'll just say that we seem to be doing almost everything in our power to encourage some countries to either acquire nuclear weapons or get very close to having them. If you just think about what American policy towards Iran has been for the last 30 or 40 years, what better set of incentives you could give any country to think it might be better off having a nuclear weapon than to have, as a declared policy of the US government, hopefully to overthrow the country at some point. So we have an interest in discouraging the spread of weapons of mass destruction there. I'm not sure we've always pursued that interest as intelligently as we should. The final point I'd make here is that none of these interests require the United States to try and control the Middle East, to manage the local politics of the region, to transform governments in the region. We mostly want to make sure that no single hostile power controls those energy resources and is able to dominate the region. And the good news is no one's able to do that. No country is in a position to dominate the Middle East. You can even argue the Middle East has never been more divided than it is right now. So in a sense, from a purely strategic point of view, the United States would and here I agree completely with Aaron, the United States would advance its strategic interests more readily with a much more hands-off, much more distant or disengaged policy as well. Last point I would make is we also have some interests there that stem from our sense of moral principles. As Aaron said, we'd like it if some of these countries were more responsible, more democratic, were respecting human rights in a variety of different ways, and I suspect this will come up in the course of the conversation. It's not obvious to me that the policies the United States is following are consistent with the moral principles we often claim to represent. And I'll leave it at that.
Can I just add, I'd add one point on the last point that Steve made. You know, I worked for a half dozen administrations, Democrats and Republicans. No administration that I've ever worked for put human rights or the promotion of democracy at the top of the pile. And I can give you any number of instances, our responsibility to protect. We've been, to say the least, intervention to stop mass killing or genocide has been the exception rather than the rule. I mean, where do you want to start? The Nazi Holocaust, Cambodia, Rwanda, Darfur, South Sudan, Syria, Myanmar. We have to be honest about the inconsistencies and the hypocrisies that exist with respect to our human rights policies. Because even in the Biden administration, it was determined to repair the damage done under its predecessor, under the presumptive Republican nominee. It basically, the United States took a vacation when it came to moral principle or any sort of ethical manifestation in its foreign policy. And yet, the administration has already made a decision with Saudi Arabia, which has emerged as an incredibly repressive and oppressive regime under the tutelage of Mohammed bin Salman, aka MBS, to conclude, and it's all done, a mutual defense pact with Saudi Arabia, as well as supporting Saudi Arabia's nuclear industry. This to an incredibly repressive regime. And I think it opens the door to charges of inconsistency, to say the least, but hypocrisy, which doesn't sit well. So I don't know how to fix this problem, particularly when our allies violate human rights law or international humanitarian law. It's easy to do it with our adversaries. It's much harder to do with those countries with whom we have closer relations. It's a tough problem.
I'd like to just follow up. I mean, you said Israeli-Palestinian peace would be nice for the United States to have, but is not a vital interest or necessarily a strategic interest at this point. What about the argument that, you know, to continue to have good relations with the Arab world, to sort of keep this counterbalancing coalition against Iran that has emerged in place? Is that just something that would be helpful, or do you think this is, leaving aside the feasibility of it at this point, just not something that's all that important from a U.S. strategic standpoint?
You could make a compelling argument, I used to make it, that in fact it is a vital interest, that if only we could solve the core of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then all of our other interests in the region would somehow be magically protected. It really doesn't add up. The Arab Spring suggested that the problems in this region, problems of governance, the problems divides between the haves and the have-nots in the Middle East, and between the cans and the cannots, those who can govern their societies or participate in them, and those who cannot. The absence of transparency, the absence of gender equality, the abuse of human rights. This is the most broken, angry, dysfunctional region in the world, and we cannot fix it. We can try to contain, we could try to manage. And if I thought there was a reasonable chance that we could actually, if there's anything we could actually do that would get Israelis and Palestinians into a negotiation to solve the 5 core issues that need to be resolved: borders, security, refugees, Jerusalem, and end of all conflict and claims. These are the issues we struggled with at the last serious effort in Camp David in July of 2000. That's 24 years ago. And the gaps between the parties then were this big after 14 days. Now, in the wake of October 7, it undermines, I think, takes credulity to the breaking point to assume that there is something that we could do or resources we could invest that would somehow create a quick and put Israelis and Palestinians even on a pathway toward resolution. It may happen, but it's going to require changes that we simply cannot manufacture.
I want to take that point and push it even further. Right? So if you think about it, if you, in the next 10 years, got a two-state solution, a genuine two-state solution, that'd be a good thing. But it actually would not affect the lives of most Americans at all. Wouldn't make us safer, wouldn't make us more prosperous. It'd be a good thing. Right? If you got a one-state solution, right, that wouldn't affect the lives of most Americans one way or the other as well. In fact, what happens in that particular conflict is not going to affect the lives of most Americans at all, right? When you think of what's happening in Sudan today or what's been happening in Ukraine, that doesn't have a direct effect on most Americans as well. So what happens between the 7.5 million Israeli Jews and the 7.5 million Palestinian Arabs ultimately is not going to affect the lives of most Americans very much. A small number of Americans care very deeply about this, that I get, but the rest of America will be just fine regardless of what happens. And I would say the same thing about Jordan. I'd say the same thing about Iraq. Look at all that Iraq has been through since the United States invaded in 2003, and ultimately the lives of most Americans, we've just gone on. We've put that in the memory hole, although we did spend several $1 trillion doing it, which we could have done more useful things with. Again, what I'm suggesting is these things actually don't matter all that much to us as well. And I agree again with Aaron that our ability to shape the local politics of this region is quite limited. So what should we be doing? Well, we should have, instead of having, one final thing. If what happens between Israel and Palestine doesn't matter that much to Americans, then there is a puzzling question. Why did the U.S. Congress just send another, $24 billion?
26.
$26 billion to one of those parties as if it really mattered to Americans when it really doesn't. It doesn't affect their security, it doesn't affect their prosperity, and it's not doing very much for our image on the world stage. Now, what should we be doing? Well, we should be having normal relationships with everyone in the Middle East. Instead of special relationships with some countries in the Middle East, Israel, to some extent Egypt, and perhaps eventually to Saudi Arabia, and no relationship whatsoever with other countries in the region, such as Iran. I'll give you an example of a country that has a slightly different approach to this problem, China. China has relations with everyone in the Middle East. They talk to everyone, they trade with everyone, right? They don't have special relations with some countries and no relationships with others. And among other things, over time, this starts to give China more influence and leverage. So if I have a fantasy, and Aaron can tell me why this fantasy is wrong, my fantasy would be the next time Antony Blinken goes to Riyadh to talk to MBS, when he announces he needs his plane fueled, he says, and my next stop is Tehran, right? Because if MBS knows that Blinken is off to Tehran. And by the way, when he gets to Tehran, he says his next stop is Tel Aviv. And when he's in Tel Aviv, he says he's going to Ankara, right? That's how you start to maximize American leverage, because you're suddenly giving all of the people at each of those stops an incentive to tell Blinken something he wants to hear, for fear that he might hear something better at his next stop. And what the United States has done for decades now is the exact opposite. And it's one of the reasons we've had so little leverage over our closest allies in the region for so many years.
I just add one, there's another elemental point with respect to negotiations. And that is, the Middle East is literally littered with the remains of great powers throughout time who believed wrongly they could impose their schemes, their dreams, their aspirations on smaller ones. And the reality is, in this neighborhood, in an existential conflict, which is precisely the way most of the Arab-Israeli conflicts, and certainly the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, are perceived. In an existential conflict, when the parties, when the combatants elevate the stakes to the level of vital national interest, even existence, the influence of the United States, the leverage that the United States is capable of exerting on these combatants, even though, in the case of the Israelis, there's an extraordinary dependency. And we can talk about the U.S.-Israeli relationship, but other factors that limit the ability or willingness of any administration, particularly this one, because Joe Biden is alone among modern American presidents. And I've watched a half a dozen deal with the issue of Israel. Alone among modern American presidents, Joe Biden has this unique bond, moral and emotional bond with Israel. But our influence and our willingness to use that influence successfully, not just virtue signaling, that's easy, but to actually use our leverage, our power, to influence our partners and or allies' interests is really quite narrow. It's not just in the case of Israel. It's with all of our partners and all of our allies. We can leverage or impose sanctions on Russia and China, but for any number of reasons, we're unable and or unwilling, and it's not, regardless of political party, to do this. And I think it's stunning that 6 months into this war, it is the two major combatants, Israel and Hamas, that have shaped the trajectory, the intensity, the prospects for escalation and de-escalation. And the United States, the UN, the vaunted international community has had a very little influence. And in large part, I think leverage is fine, but if you have to use it, you better succeed in actually using it and accomplishing what it is you set out to do. Because if you try and you fail, well, then the default position is weakness. And that's another serious set of consequences.
So this is where I think we can now get a disagreement. So first of all, I think it's a mistake to attribute American policy since October 7th to what's bouncing around inside Joe Biden's brain. I agree that Joe Biden has a particularly strong emotional attachment, but he didn't come by that by accident. That's a product in part of 40 years of being in American politics as well. And of course, Joe Biden's response is not that different from the way Donald Trump dealt with the Middle East. And Donald Trump doesn't have a deep emotional attachment to anyone, as near as I can tell, except perhaps himself. All right. Moreover, you had before Trump, you had Barack Obama, who did have a different view of what had to be done in the Middle East. I think was genuinely committed, really wanted to try and achieve a two-state solution, but he never exerted any leverage either, and neither did George W. Bush, and neither did Bill Clinton. So it's not what's in Joe Biden's head. There's something else explaining why American politicians, American presidents, never even try to exert real leverage on our relations with Israel as well. So second point I'd make is actually there's a large literature on economic leverage and where it comes from. And the great paradox in this literature, what this literature tells you is that in fact leverage works best with your allies, right? Not with your adversaries. We don't have much economic leverage on North Korea because we have hardly any economic, in fact, we have no economic relationship. When we put sanctions on North Korea, it makes almost no difference. When South Korea was thinking about getting nuclear weapons, the United States threatened to sever economic ties with South Korea. They paid attention because they really depended on that economic relationship, and they knew if they didn't get nuclear weapons, the relationship would continue well into the future, as it has. So paradoxically, you actually have more leverage over countries that depend upon you and are hoping to keep depending on you for many years to come. So an American president who wanted to exert leverage on Israel has lots to do, and Israelis would respond to this because they don't want to lose the expectation of lots of future benefits, not just aid, but also the economic relationship and all the other things that connect the two societies. So I guess, I refuse to believe that we have no leverage in this situation, and I would love it if we tried just once.
Steve makes an interesting point, just a few sort of notes. We have, in fact, over time, been willing to use leverage. In fact, the first president to actually use serious leverage to get results was Eisenhower, who threatened to sanction the Israelis if they didn't withdraw from Sinai. I worked for Bush 41 and James Baker. We were on our way to the Madrid Peace Conference. Every time we showed up in Jerusalem, there was another settlement. Baker outmaneuvered the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee and Prime Minister Shamir, cutting a deal with Congress that the Shamir government would not get the $10 billion housing loan guarantees that they wanted. And Shamir went on to defeat. He was defeated by Rabin. 2 months later, Rabin got the housing loan guarantees.
And the settlement stopped.
No, the settlements, as Steve well knows, the settlements did not stop. I would just add a couple correctives. I think that, because I do believe, even though, as Steve well knows, the U.S.-Israeli relationship functions within what I would call a certain operating system, which creates certain parameters, certain do's and don'ts, and Steve's 100% right, which most American presidents, regardless of party, adhere to. But I would venture to say that had Barack Obama been president, not Joe Biden, that on one or two issues, our policy would be different. Number one, I think, and I did an interview with the New Yorker a couple weeks ago, and the last question was, do you think that Joe Biden shows the same degree of empathy for Palestinians as he does for Israel? And I went through a long explanation as to why he did not. The answer is he does not. He does not convey the same sense of pain and empathy. If you listen to Biden's speech on October 10th, 3 days after Hamas attacks, he talks about the, quote, black hole of loss. You watch him, he's conflated the losses, the deep sense of trauma in the wake of October 7, the indiscriminate, willful killing, the sexual predation, the raping, the taking of hostages, with his own personal tragedies in his own life. If Obama had been president, I suspect that, first, the tonal differences would fundamentally be different. You would not hear Barack Obama talk about, I'm a Zionist. You would not hear Barack Obama say, if there were no Israel, we'd have to create one. And number two, I also believe that on the question of humanitarian assistance, where the United States has fundamentally dropped the ball months ago, and this is an area where leverage should have been applied and the Israelis would have responded months ago, the administration should have been hammering the current Israeli government. We didn't have to airdrop and get the Jordanians and the Emirates to help airdrop pallets of food for Palestinians. The port of Ashdod is 20 miles north of Gaza. It has all of the screening facilities required for a massive infusion of humanitarian assistance. The Israelis resisted because Israeli public opinion could not abide the fact that Hamas is holding and abusing its people. They will be damned if they were going to do anything to go above and beyond to support the humanitarian needs of Palestinians. Plus, you're dealing with the most extreme right-wing government in the history of the State of Israel, two ministers with large budgets and heavy ideologies, determined to annex the West Bank and everything but name as Gaza is unfolding. I think that the administration policy could have been different, but let me be very clear. More than 6 months into this conflict, the administration has been reluctant and has refused to impose any cost or consequence that you and I, as normal humans, would regard as significant pressure and serious consequence. There are three baskets. Biden could have drawn from any of them. He could have conditioned or restricted the delivery of munitions. Reagan delayed the shipment of F-16s when the Israelis bombed PLO headquarters, and again when the Israelis extended administrative law over the Golan Heights in 1981. He did not restrict, and in my judgment, will not restrict military assistance. Number two, the administration could have introduced its own Security Council resolution or voted for somebody else's that was very critical of Israel. Didn't do that. And number three, which would have been the nuclear option, it could have abandoned the notion of negotiating between Israel and Hamas for a hostage exchange and a 6-week temporary ceasefire, and joined the rest of the international community in demanding a cessation of hostilities, full stop. Then we'll deal with the hostages. Then we'll deal with the economic situation in Gaza. And I see no indication whatsoever that the administration is on the cusp of exerting any of that leverage for any number of reasons, which go to domestic politics, Joe Biden's emotional commitment, and one other thing. I think the president still believes that if he's going to change the pictures in Gaza, de-escalate, stop the Israeli ground campaign, surge humanitarian assistance, free hostages, and get a 6-week ceasefire on which they would like to build, he cannot do that by renouncing or calling out the current government. I think that notion, he's still very much attached to that notion, and I think that's why 6+ months in, where we are.
This is great. I feel like I don't have to do anything. Since we're on this topic now, this is a question you've both written about a lot, and I get from students constantly. So how do you make sense of the U.S.-Israeli special relationship? I mean, fundamentally, what drives it? Is it strategic considerations that Israel is a strategic asset? Is it moral considerations? Or as you just alluded to, is it mainly about domestic politics in the United States? I think people would be interested in hearing your thoughts about that.
Well, I wrote a book on the subject, and I can't really repudiate it now. I think 95% of this equation is domestic politics, and it's an old story in American politics. It's interest group politics, and there are well-organized, very effective, well-funded interest groups on the side of maintaining the special relationship with Israel. AIPAC, but not just AIPAC, the ADL, a whole series of other groups and related, connected. They don't agree on every issue, but what they do almost all agree on is that the United States should support Israel no matter what it does. Right, that's the bottom line. If you go on the AIPAC website and see what they're saying today, same sort of thing. Doesn't matter what Israel does, it should have unconditional American backing, military aid, diplomatic support, diplomatic protection in the United Nations Security Council, etc. They are extremely good at doing this the same way that the NRA is extremely good at preventing gun control, even though most Americans would like some gun control. The same way the farm lobby is very good at getting support for farmers, even though farmers are only 2% of the American population right now. So there's nothing magical about this. It's just that in this case, there's a very powerful set of organizations that work very hard, that spend lots of money, that contribute a lot of money to political candidates in both parties, et cetera. And this explains 90% of why the United States has the Middle East policy that it does, especially with respect to Israel-Palestine. And that hasn't changed yet. There are some cracks in the edifice. You know, when Chuck Schumer gets in the well of the Senate and delivers a speech very critical of the Netanyahu government, that's an interesting development. when there are 30 or 40 people voting in Congress against an aid package. That's an interesting development. So you could argue that the tectonic plates are shifting, but they have not shifted enough to where you get a substantial shift in American politics. And until that changes, we're still going to have a very one-sided approach here that costs the United States a considerable amount of goodwill on the international stage and leads to recurring conflicts like we had. What's happening in Gaza today is the worst conflict that's happened in a long time, but it's hardly the only one that has stemmed out of the inherent inequities in the relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And the United States has basically been complicit in that, not just the last 6 months, but for many, many years, and it's mostly because of domestic politics.
Right, so finally we can part company, but here's my take. Having actually been lobbied and watched a half dozen American secretaries of state and 4 presidents deal with Israel, I would say that there's no question that domestic politics plays a considerable role in how this relationship has evolved. And lobbies, in this case, it's more than just the 5.5 million American Jews, of course. It's millions of evangelical Christians. There's absolutely no doubt that Donald Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and move the embassy had very little to do with Donald Trump's convictions with respect to Israel. It had to do with his determination to lock up the evangelical vote. So there's no question that domestic politics plays a role. But domestic politics offers up a powerful voice, in my judgment, based on my experience, but not a veto. A powerful voice, but not a veto. Not a single arms sale that a willful and skillful American president wanted to get through Congress, failed to get through Congress as a consequence of domestic opposition. Barack Obama's efforts to produce a flawed but functional Iranian nuclear agreement created huge domestic upset. You had an Israeli prime minister invited by then Speaker of the House, John Boehner, and by the way, it's not beyond the realm of imagination to imagine between now and November, Mr. Netanyahu getting another invitation from a joint session. Chuck Schumer, by the way, has already agreed that if he's invited, he'll speak before Congress. So Obama got what he wanted. Bush 41 and Baker got what he wanted. So my read on the U.S.-Israel relationship is that it is not possible for 5.5 million American Jews to basically have a stranglehold on American foreign policy. There has to be support from the non-Jewish elites. And yes, it's absolutely true that the American Israel Public Affairs Committee has become adept. Now they've moved on to darker territory in terms of supporting Republican candidates as long as they're good on Israel. If they happen to be Trumpers, so be it. But I think there are other factors involved in terms of the evolution of the relationship, which has helped form the opinions of non-Jewish elites in this country, including evangelicals. When it comes to evangelicals, let's be clear, and younger evangelicals may be different than their parents, but for reasons of eschatology, what happens at the end of days and value affinity, millions of evangelicals support Israel out of a deep sense of commitment and belief, how Israel figures prominently in their religious conception. You also still have, I would argue, this fundamental sort of post-Holocaust depth of feeling that also bleeds into the perception of Israeli security, which shapes the way domestic opinion deals with Israel. But in the end, it's one factor more than any other. one factor. It's not Israel as a strategic ally, strategic partner of the United States. It's not the moral debt that the U.S. believes it owes to the Jewish people in the wake of the Nazi genocide. It's not, in my judgment, in the main domestic politics. It's what makes domestic political support possible. And that is one factor. I call it value affinity. And it is that factor, as Steve rightly points out, that is under enormous stress. It has become increasingly fraught. The perception that Israel is a democratic polity, even though it's a preferential democracy, it's not a democracy for all of its citizens. It's nearing 10 million people population-wise, and yet 2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel, even though they're guaranteed equality under the Declaration of Independence, suffer systemic economic and social discrimination. Much, I suspect, as the African American community before the Civil Rights Act were passed. It's an imperfect analogy, but the notion of preferential democracy, I think, is very apt. But that perception that Israel is a democracy in a region of undemocratic authoritarian polities, I think, is critical here. And it's always been my contention that when the image of Israel changes in the mind of America, the nature of the U.S.-Israeli relationship is going to change. My acid test is when I see large numbers of Democrats and Republicans having significant and serious debates about U.S. policy toward Israel. Then I think you actually will see the change. But for now, and 6 months plus of the Israel-Hamas war, I think proves Steve's point that the U.S.-Israeli operating system is still very much in effect.
I'm not sure where to go with this. A couple of thoughts. One is that 40 years ago, you could make the argument that Israel was a strategic asset in the context of the Cold War, and that we were two countries that had similar values. It's a democracy. You heard that line a lot. Of course, it's never been a liberal democracy where citizens have one right of any kind, have equal rights, one person, one vote kind of situation. It's not a melting pot democracy like we like to think of ourselves as being. So there were, even back in those days, real differences. But it's not just the Gaza war, of course, it's the 50 years of occupation as well. So there are 15 million people controlled by Israel, half of whom are denied are denied political equality, and most of them are denied all political rights whatsoever. Right? And that's not consistent with any set of American values that we would ever brag about, whatever our actual behavior might be. So the strategic argument ended when the Cold War ended. Israel's not a strategic asset in the Middle East in any particular way. And the moral argument has been eroding, as Aaron just said, over time. And of course, Gaza is the latest thing. And you are, in fact, seeing those cracks in the edifice. I wanted to add one other point. When I refer to Israel, I obviously think of groups like AIPAC, but it's not just that. It's a broad coalition of different organizations, different people as well. And one of its key features has been an attempt to shape the discourse in the United States, guide what people think, create a very positive impression. And Aaron has, I think, quite rightly testified that impression worked. But it's not working nearly as well, partly because of what's happened in the region over time, partly because the treatment of the Palestinians has gotten worse and worse, partly because the settlements keep going, even though American secretaries of state and presidents call them an impediment to peace, but do nothing to actually stop them from spreading, et cetera. So the image has gotten worse, but also the commanding heights, if you will, of media have been broken up. There are more sources to go for. There's lots of websites, some of which you shouldn't trust, many of which you should trust, lots of alternative media sources, journalists who've been able to present a different view on this subject in ways that they didn't 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. So I think American attitudes are shifting for a variety of reasons, and I think this makes most of the people who I would call part of the so-called Israel lobby, both Jews and American evangelicals, very nervous, because the more people find out what's really going on over there, the less they like American complicity in it.
I want to talk about Iran, and I also want to ask you about Camp David. So if we have time, I'll come back to it. But Steve, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts before we move to Iran. You know, it's a big question, but as briefly as possible, for you to react, your reactions to the protests we've seen in recent weeks and how it relates to the concept of academic freedom, and the response we've seen from administrators at places like Columbia.
I'll come back tomorrow for 2 hours on the subject. No, this is a huge issue. I think it's not at all surprising that we've seen the outpouring of responses on college campuses, and that most of those demonstrations, if not all of those demonstrations, feature, Gentiles, young American Jews, and Arab Americans or Palestinian Americans. It's quite a coalition there as well. And they're reacting to the things that they're seeing, the things they can watch, things they can observe on social media, et cetera. I don't think any of that is at all surprising. It is also not surprising to me, but deeply disturbing, that of course that reaction has provoked a counter-reaction accusing these groups of the worst forms of anti-Semitism and things like that, and now putting pressure on academic institutions to crack down on them. And unfortunately, a number of academic institutions, such as Columbia, have now done so. And the people who are doing this, including many members of Congress, I believe are not doing this because of their deep-seated concern for the safety of students on these campuses or American policy in the Middle East. They're doing this for a much broader goal of basically trying to infringe upon and constrain academic freedom in American higher education, because they don't like the fact that there's lots of independent thought in universities. And if I can digress for just a second, universities, in my view, play an absolutely critical role, an almost a unique role in American democracy, in any democracy, because they are the most protected institutions, the places where you can think anything, pretty much say anything, and you can challenge orthodoxies. You can challenge whatever the conventional wisdom is. Universities have endowments which insulate them from pressure, and professors have tenure so they can say what they think. And by the way, those criticisms of the conventional wisdom can come from any direction. They can come from the right just as easily as from the left. Right? So to quote a famous report from the University of Chicago, the Calvin report, a university by its very nature should be upsetting, like Socrates. Right? We challenge orthodoxies. We question. We look for better answers. We don't accept what's necessarily being told to us. And universities are in a better position to do that than any other institution in a democracy. Right? That's what they're for. And if we're doing our jobs, we're trying to train our students to think critically, and think for themselves as well. And there are some people, by the way, this explains why all autocrats, the Viktor Orbáns of the world, the Vladimir Putins of the world, do not want to have universities that operate independently. Xi Jinping does not want to have full academic freedom. We want to have it here in this country because we want to keep the democracy healthy. That's why I think universities should encourage students to question. They should allow students to protest. They should not overreact, as long as those activities don't infringe upon the ability of everyone at that university to continue to do their work, to take their classes and do everything. And one final point, that's the other reason why universities as an institution should not be taking a position on these issues. I don't want the president of Harvard to tell me what he or she thinks should be the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't want the president to state a position. I don't want Harvard to state a position. I want students and faculty at Harvard to be arguing about that, to be discussing it from a wide variety of views. And as soon as the institution tries to take a position, it immediately starts to marginalize or silence any members of the community who might disagree. And that's not the job of a university. The job of a university is to encourage as broad a thought as possible, not to start saying, this is true, this is right, this is false, this is evil. Sorry, end of speech.
All right, we've got the easy issues out of the way.
I was going to actually add.
Please.
Unless we're running out of time, you tell me.
We are, but you can go for it.
I'll pose the same question to this audience that I posed to Professor McDonald's class earlier today, because I don't understand. I was in Ann Arbor during the 70s, during Vietnam. I was not in government. And I mentioned this to Steve earlier. I've never seen any issue, royal American domestic politics, like the Israel-Hamas war has roiled campuses, political culture, the media. And I don't understand. I mean, we were deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 years. We had a volunteer military. Americans were dying. We were killing scores of thousands of Afghans and Iraqis. And nothing came close, these many years, to the kinds of upset and people being driven to their respective corners without regard for any rationality or sensitivity to any of the issues and the traumas of both communities. I don't understand it. That's my question, I wouldn't presume to try to answer it because I don't know. My comment, however, to everyone here, I ran an organization when I left the State Department called Seeds of Peace. Brought young Israelis, Palestinians, Egyptians, Jordanians, Indians, Pakistanis, Afghans into coexistence and conflict resolution programming in Maine, and then it followed up in the region. I saw 14, 15, and 16-year-old Israelis and Palestinians get off the bus from Logan or Newark, jet-lagged. You ask them how they slept the next morning, and several invariably would say, I didn't sleep. Are you sick? No. Are you homesick? No. Why didn't you fall asleep? I didn't fall asleep because I thought harm would come to me during the course of the night from the so-called other. And yet within 3 weeks, these 14, 15, and 16-year-olds who have been exposed to trauma and real loss as a consequence of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are openly mourning the fact, crying, because they're going from a bit of the future back into the past, where their rabbis, their imams, their priests, their parents, their journalists, their politicians will tell them why you can't talk to the other. So I do not understand. These kids are traumatized by the real conflict, not by the other Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is taking place here, where in the security and prosperity of the United States, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, American Jews, Americans generally, cannot sit down and understand the pain and the trauma of the other. They have to have a monopoly, each side, on the pain. I do not understand it. Maybe I'm too rational or too sensitive. Maybe I had a mother who told me about caring for others. But I don't get it. I really don't get it. It's like the diaspora community here has a greater stake in fighting these battles because they can fight them without cost or consequence. And I mean, it's a cri de coeur. And I make this point wherever I go. I ask the question, I don't have an answer. But it's something I think everybody should at least consider thinking through.
I do want to talk about Iran. how did we get to where we are today, where the relationship is as bad as it is and seemingly gets worse year over year? If you could briefly talk about, put this in historical context for us, and how the relationship has changed over time with Iran. And also comment on, one frequently sees the Iranians run an authoritarian theocracy run by hardline ideologues. The idea of being able to do business with them on a power political basis simply isn't possible. Obviously, the hostage crisis from the late 70s, its support for Lebanese Hezbollah, comments like that made by former President Ahmadinejad all weigh into those sorts of views. So what do you make of those sorts of claims as well?
So there's a lot here to try and unpack quickly. I mean, first of all, we have a proof, we have an existence theorem that the United States and Iran can work out some problems. And that was the JCPOA negotiated by the Obama administration. Not a perfect deal, but in my view, a pretty good deal. And it was possible because the United States stopped insisting that Iran do everything we demanded first, and then we would talk about its concerns. We ultimately agreed to a compromise, and it's a compromise that rolled back Iran's nuclear program substantially, and it was a catastrophic mistake for the Trump administration to walk away from it, because of course Iran is now much closer to being able to build a nuclear weapon than it was before, and we have reinforced the Iranian belief that you can't trust the Americans. You sign an agreement with them, and 2 years later, somebody tears it up. Why bother to even negotiate? So we've got a harder problem there. Now, we've got a bad relationship with them going back, decades as well, back to the Iranian Revolution, or if you ask an Iranian, back to 1953. And one of the real barriers here, of course, is that these two societies, and certainly the leaders in both societies, have very different views of this history. Right? You ask an American about Iran, and you get, the fall of the Shah, mobs chanting death to America, maybe a mention of Ahmadinejad, the nuclear program, etc. You ask an Iranian about the relationship, they'll mention the '53 coup, they'll mention the support we gave Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war, which was a traumatizing event for the current ruling generation in Iran. So we have we have trouble understanding each other because we have very different historical reference points as well. That said, Iran has reached out to us on several occasions in the 1990s under Rafsanjani, after September 11th, all right, when they were worried actually that we might be coming after them as well. So I actually think the Iranians have done a better job of trying to maybe restart a more normal relationship with us. The one thing they insist upon, of course, is that they cannot be excluded from discussions of whatever the regional order in the Middle East is going to be. It's worth remembering that Iran wasn't supporting Hamas or really caring very much about the Palestinian cause at all prior to 1991. When we excluded them from the Madrid conference, right, that's when they began supporting Palestinians, because that was a way of reminding the United States and others that they could not be ignored. They couldn't be excluded, and we're going to have to acknowledge that as well. It'd be very much in our interest to try and lower that temperature. It would also be in the interests of others in the region. It's one of the reasons Saudi Arabia, which has no love lost for Tehran, has been pursuing something of a détente with them in recent years as well. So last point I'll make here, if you look at sort of the various players in the region right now and ask who's been acting in the most sort of shrewd, sober, careful, rational fashion over the last 6 months, I'd argue Iran. Right? They made it very clear after October 7th that they had no desire to get seriously involved. They did not want to see this escalate. They didn't want Hezbollah to start anything. They didn't want to cause a lot of trouble. When the Israelis attacked their consulate in Syria, killed some senior officials, they said they were going to respond, and they did. And they gave us 72 hours warning, and they carefully structured their response to signal unmistakably, they did not want this to get any bigger. And fortunately, and here I will give the Biden administration some credit, they were able to, I think, work with the Israelis and others to keep the lid on at this point. But by and large, I'd say the Iranians have behaved more sensibly than some other actors in the region in responding to what is ultimately, a deeply troubling set of events. And we ought to remember that the next time someone tries to tell you that there are a bunch of irrational, religious fanatics who you can't deal with.
I have a different view than Steve. I think we have a strategic problem with Iran, and we do not have a strategic solution. The best we can do with this Iranian regime is to transact. And the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear agreement, was flawed but highly functional. It was, to say the least, a disastrous move by the Trump administration to abrogate it, unilaterally abrogate it. At the same time, I think you're dealing with, forget fanatics, you're dealing with a heavily ideological regime that both for offensive and defensive reasons has an interest in trying to influence the states around them. Shia only constitute 10% of Muslims in the world, and the Iranians understand that they're in a Sunni world. But in Iraq, which is their primary area of competition with the United States, obviously geography is destiny here. So the fact that the Iranians share common borders with Iraq, which is demographically predominantly Shia, Lebanon is their window into the Arab-Israeli conflict, their support for Hamas, as far as we know, told no one about October 7, least of all the Iranians. But Iranian support, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard training of Hezbollah and Hamas is a key issue in Iranian foreign policy. I also think that the Iranians would like to use the United States as an agent of mobilization in terms of distraction from their own internal problems. It is a regime that is schooled in repression and oppression. Their goals are to, if possible, drive the United States out of the region, and they oppose the U.S. influence where they can find it. I mean, the most compelling piece of information is Iran's relationship with Vladimir Putin, and the expertise and the technology and sheer volume of drones the Iranians have supplied to the Russians in their war against Ukraine. So I see no ending to this. This is a very, very dangerous Iranian-Israeli rivalry, and I suspect that the recent exchange of strikes against one another's territory raise one fundamental question for me. Will the strikes of April 13th, 14th, and the Israeli retaliation of the next Saturday create more risk readiness on the part of Israel and Iran now that they have crossed the red line without an escalation? Will it lead to some sort of new normal, risk readiness, or alternatively, have they both understood and want to avoid the prospects of a regional escalation, something the Middle East has never experienced before? And will it create risk aversion? I don't know what the answer is, but the Iranian-Israeli relationship and the U.S.-Iranian relationship is going to be hanging over this region for a long time to come. And I see no way, it's a strategic cul-de-sac. I see no way out of this, given the toxicity of the Iranian issue in American domestic politics, and the Ayatollah, the supreme leader, who is thinking seriously about succession, which is why he does not want a major conflict with either Israel or the United States. Succession and preservation of the revolution, what remains of it, all politics are local, and in Khamenei's mind, that's the supreme objective right now.
So then I have to ask, particularly since at the outset, Aaron, you said a vital U.S. interest is preventing the rise of a regional hegemon, especially one armed with nuclear weapons. Steve mentioned Iran is much closer to having enough fissile material to fabricate a nuclear bomb. The testimony I've seen in front of Congress is they're as close as 12 days away from having the amount of fissile material they need. This is obviously a program that's been ongoing for decades, so in terms of weaponization, my assumption would be they're not going to be too far off on that, which raises the question, if something like the JCPOA or an Iran nuclear agreement cannot be resuscitated, would you support the use of U.S. military action against Iran's nuclear facilities to forestall Iranian nuclearization?
You know, I'm not running the railroad. You have 5 American presidents that are on record as saying that they will not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. You can draw your own conclusions. The Iranians are probably, if you believe Rafael Grossi, the head of the IAEA, the Iranians are weeks away from producing enough fissile material for several nuclear weapons. That doesn't mean they're on the cusp of producing a nuclear weapon. You need to miniaturize the warhead, you need a physics package, you need a delivery system. But they are a nuclear weapons threshold state. They have all the elements, all the scientific knowledge that should they decide to weaponize, they could weaponize. Whether or not we and or the Israelis or the IAEA would actually, whether or not we know right now where the Iranians are in their weaponization program is highly arguable. So do I think that the United States should move to destroy Iran's nuclear program? I think that well before that happened, the Israelis might act before we would, even though their capacity for destroying Iran's nuclear program is highly limited. So, yeah, I mean, I can see this. I can see, it doesn't require much imagination to see an escalatory threshold where if, in fact, the Iranians had made a decision to weaponizing, that the U.S. would be drawn into a major confrontation with Iran. Yeah, I can see it.
I can see it too, and it would be a huge mistake. First of all, you're not going to be able to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon by destroying their current nuclear infrastructure, right? And if you wanted to give a country an incentive to acquire a nuclear deterrent, showing that you're willing to attack them when they don't yet have one is a good way of saying, you know, you might be better off if you actually had one. North Korea always likes to point out what happened to Saddam Hussein, who didn't have a nuclear weapon, what happened to Muammar Gaddafi, who agreed to give his WMD programs up. They're no longer with us, but guess what? The Kim family is still running North Korea. And one of the reasons they're still running North Korea is not the only reason, but one of the reasons is they have nuclear weapons. And so the military action to overthrow them is just too damn dangerous. Right? So yes, we could damage we can't destroy the knowledge that they have. Right? We can destroy the infrastructure. They will build it deeper. They will, I think, be much more resolved to actually get one. So you can kick the can down the road, but you can't actually stop it. I think if Iran had wanted to make a sprint for the bomb, they would have done so already. They've had the infrastructure available for a long time now. And I think they have preferred to be, as Aaron said, a latent nuclear power, close enough that it's an option if they feel they ultimately need it, but not incurring the costs and risks of actually crossing the line, going for it as well. Again, because I don't think they want a major war against the United States. The other thing we should remember is that populations, we've seen this time and time again, populations rarely respond positively to having a lot of bombs dropped on them. Not true in Ukraine, not true in Gaza, not true anywhere that I can imagine. So a big American attack on Iran is not going to make the Iranian people suddenly decide to overthrow the clerics and become a democracy. It's going to make them mad as hell at us, and suddenly popular support for actually redoubling their efforts, getting the kind of capability that Israel has, a substantial arsenal of nuclear weapons, the kind of capability that North Korea has that protects it despite its manifest failings, right, will start to look pretty damn tempting to Iran. So I think that would be an enormous mistake on Israel's part to try it, and on our part to help.
So what would you say to those who make the claim, if Iran gets the bomb, then the Saudis will get the bomb, then the Turks will get the bomb, and so You know, we've seen Israel attack the Osirak reactor in Iraq in 1981, Syria 2007, successful counter-proliferation. Why not use that option again?
Well, for one thing, the Osirak attack, of course, led Saddam Hussein to redouble his efforts to acquire weapons of mass destruction, and they got closer than we had realized, which is at least an instructive warning on that regard. I don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons. I don't want Saudi Arabia to get nuclear weapons. It's one of the reasons I would oppose a security package for Saudi Arabia, which involves a lot of nuclear sharing with Saudi Arabia as well. We can debate that another time as well. But I do think we tend to be sometimes overly panicky about the prospect that a couple more countries are going to get them. Right? Every country that has gotten nuclear weapons, particularly countries we didn't like, there have been enormous sort of doom and gloom. You know, what if Mao Zedong gets the bomb? Right? He has said some crazy things about nuclear weapons. He said that they could lose 300 million people and it wouldn't be a problem. It'll be a terrible disaster. China got the bomb, didn't build very many of them, didn't suddenly launch an aggressive foreign policy or anything like that under Mao Zedong. Similarly, you know, I'm not happy that North Korea has nuclear weapons. I'd be much happier if they didn't. But it's not like they got these things and immediately called up Tokyo and demanded Tokyo surrender. Right? Nuclear weapons are pretty good for one thing. They're pretty good at deterring attacks on your own homeland, substantial attacks. They're good at maintaining the survival of your regime, the survival of your country. They're not very good for coercing other people. If they were really good at coercing others, we could tell lots of other countries what to do by threatening to bomb them, and we don't because it wouldn't work. Right? So again, I wouldn't panic. I wouldn't like to see a proliferation chain occurring in the Middle East, but I wouldn't necessarily panic about it either. And the question is, what are you willing to do to prevent it from happening? And in this case, the cure may be worse than the disease.
Do we get concluding comments?
By all means.
I like
And the audience should get its chance.
We're getting there after the concluding.
Yeah, George Wilt said that when it comes to foreign policy, Americans want as little of it as possible. And I would say to all of you, and this is an editorial comment, so forgive me. I work for Republicans and Democrats. I voted for Republicans and Democrats. I made this point with Professor McDonald's class, and I'll make it with you. The dividing line for an effective U.S. foreign policy is not between left and right, not between liberal and conservative, and not between Democrat and Republican. It's between dumb on one hand and smart on the other. And the only thing that matters to me is which side of the line you want America to be on, the smart side or the dumb side. If you want America to be on the smart side, then you believe deeply in something called the national interest of the United States. We can debate what that is on policy grounds, but it's not something that can be tethered to the personal vanities and political preferences of presidents. And who becomes the president, even in a system like ours, in which the founders willfully set up a system to disaggregate power and prevent individuals from acquiring it. The President of the United States has enormous power. And I'd only conclude by saying that the founders used the personal pronoun I in the U.S. Constitution only once. Why would they do that? Why does a personal pronoun appear in the U.S. Constitution? It's because they embedded the inaugural oath that the president, the man and one day woman who will hold that job, in Article 2. The oath is there. And they did it, I think, to make it unmistakably clear that the office and the man and one day woman who holds that office is subordinate and derivative of the principles and the norms in that document. So who the President of the United States is really, really important.